Welcome back to another episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamone, and I'm an acceptance coach who helps people heal from grief, loss, and trauma to discover their self acceptance and step into their personal power. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories, along with practical tools and actual insights that can help guide you along your healing journey. Today, I have a phenomenal guest with us. Her name is Lori Sase. She's a life coach, a grief tender, and a creative ally. With a background in coaching through Coach You and under mentorship for grief and soul work in renowned teacher Francis Weller, SAS supports individuals in navigating the tender terrain of grief, transition, and self-discovery. Through her practice, A Sanctuary for the Soul, Sass believes in a compassionate approach to one on one grief work. She recently launched online grief circles that offer a communal experience of healing and care through the shared stories, rituals, alchemy, and creative expression. She is also the host of the Imaginal Podcast, a heartfelt space uplifting authenticity, creativity, and the deeper layers of the human experience. She's continually inspired by her clients and is awestruck over the beauty and brilliancy of the human spirit. And so, without further ado, I'm very excited for today's episode because she has a lot of powerful gifts to share in the grief space. Sase, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris. I'm so grateful to be on the podcast. And as I was telling you, I have listened to so many of your episodes, and it does feel like you're dropping into the safest place. And as you were just introing the podcast, I thought, I wish I had this podcast and all of your guidance, like back in 2001, 2002, when I went through my very first super deep grief experiences. What a giant difference that would have made for me. And so, anyway, I really want to thank you for this pod. I'm really grateful to be on it, and I'm looking forward to talking with you a bit here.
Likewise, I'm really glad to have you on the show. I know we connected about a month or so ago, and I do remember that you have a powerful grief story of your own that I'm going to let you share and talk about. But I'm also excited that you work in the grief space in the grief field, doing similar work to me, because as I've known on my own journey here, grief is something that is very misunderstood, something that is not given very much space and makes people uncomfortable in a lot of ways. And I think that through my own personal journey and on yours as well, we've come to find that grief holds a lot of gifts, lessons, and blessings inside of that journey. That when the timing's right, it presents itself to us in a way that really reshapes our life. And so I'm excited for you to share your story and also share things you've learned along your grief journey. And so, starting out on today's episode, I'm just going to give you some space here to share with listeners where your grief journey started.
As you were speaking, the word that kept popping up is the word space. And I think that's the bit that was so hard to find when I was first experiencing grief. I guess you experience grief always throughout your life in different ways. And I would say that when I got really lost in my grief and had nowhere to turn and no idea how to deal with it, was back in 2001 when my parents both died. Well, actually, they were both going through hospice. And in 2002, they both died 2 months apart. And then a month after, one of my dear students also died. And I was teaching high school back then. And it was so anticipated, but also it felt so impossible because there was so much loss all at one time. And just to touch back in the word you said, when you said space, I think that's the part that got me so confused. I couldn't find space because I felt like the world was spinning so fast and I didn't quite know how to navigate grief and still be in my world. And so I guess, as I was thinking about how I would share my grief story, let me just list off a few more griefs and then go back to this idea of space. Um, I had different losses along the way. I think anytime you love someone or something and you lose it, there's a lot of grief. And so there is grief throughout life, as we said. And then when I lost these really significant people in my life all in a row, I think then I just started moving into life in a way that was so confusing, as I said. But then everything started toppling on top of each other, I guess, if that's the right way to say it, toppling on top of each other. But I went through a period of time that my marriage was really struggling. We ended up getting divorced. I also got really sick with a genetic disease called polycystic kidney disease, which also manifested as polycystic liver disease. And I was in medical treatment for over 10 years, and I almost died during that time. And on top of that, I really, more than anything, wanted to have children. That was like my biggest desire in life. And because of my disease and then the divorce, etc., but mostly my disease, I wasn't able to have kids. And so now looking back, I'm much older. And I guess, you never know where life is going to take you, but certainly when I look around at my life now, it's not what I had imagined or thought I would create. If create in quotes, like I didn't think that's where I would arrive in life. I don't think it's necessarily wrong or worse, but what I was hoping for, so many of those things didn't happen. I didn't anticipate losing my parents back then all at the same time, and then to go into not having children. I think it was just a lot of things in life that felt kind of chaotic. And I also thought that this marriage would be for a lifetime too. And so navigating all of those things while trying to run as fast as maybe society, our modern culture doesn't have a very big like room or space for grief. I think in a lot of ways I compromise my own self by like stifling my emotions and trying to say that I was okay and just trying to be resilient. And it's that experience of trying to navigate all of those things without ever expressing my emotion about it that made me feel so much less of maybe a person. And I think I was veering farther and farther away from my own self because I became more of a shell of myself. And because also, I think not everyone in my life, but some significant people in my life were really uncomfortable with grief and were asking me to not grieve. And maybe were getting upset at the idea of grief. And that's a complicated situation too, isn't it? Because people all grieve differently or have different toleration for grief or comfortability with it. But in that, I think that part of me that wanted to maintain those relationships or be pleasing to those people, I ended up swallowing my grief, really swallowing it. And then I lost the ability actually to feel anything. As you probably know, Chris, working with grief there, once you swallow your sadness or your anger or your frustration, if you swallow those emotions on the grief journey, you kind of lose your ability to feel joy as well. You can't really suppress one emotion and keep the rest of them. And somewhere in that journey, my grandmother passed away, and she is like was my heart and soul. She was like unconditional love, and I couldn't cry when she died. And the person who I was maybe the closest to, I had become so numb and so um, out of touch with my emotions that I knew something was really wrong. And I'm not trying to blame anyone. I think grief is like you were saying at the beginning, it's not something that's very well understood in our culture. But I had lost my way and I had lost myself. And fortunately, I found someone named Francis Weller, who you mentioned in my bio, and he is one of the leading experts in grief in our current culture. Um, and I somehow was able to meet with him and have a session with him. And afterwards, he became my therapist and now is my grief mentor. But within 10 minutes of meeting with him, I started crying, and I hadn't cried in 10 years. And I think it kind of showed me how grief needs a holding space and grief needs safety, but also there is a validity in grief and a value, like you were saying, in the grief space that is so tender and so beautiful. And it's grief is, right, a manifestation of love. Oftentimes it's love that's been lost. And so to find this allyship with grief, to find a relationship with grief, and to find a place where my grief was seen, it changed everything for me. And that's probably why I have had a heart for learning more and more about it, and why I've sort of wrapped it into my own coaching. Because life coaching is a little bit more about spirit and pursuit and dream actualization, but without grief and the integration of that experience, then we are maybe more incomplete. And so I found that really finding a holistic way of experiencing life and being able to not hide that part of ourselves or push it down has become so vital for my own life as well as my work. So I know I kind of went all over the place there. Sorry, but I don't,
No, you
everything
shared a
kept popping
beautiful
in.
story. No,
Yeah.
you shared a beautiful aspect of grief with what you just shared with us the last few minutes, and that's what I appreciate about you, by the way, is your honesty to share that and your vulnerability, by the way, because
Mm.
as listeners probably picked up on, which I love, by the way, is grief is a big messy process. It's not linear.
Yes.
It's not a clean, here's step one, two, three, four. Sometimes it's here's step 50, here's step two, here's step 10. It's all over the place. And I think that's what makes people uncomfortable about it because we are, in many ways, wired in our life to know that there's a certain pattern to follow. Like we're all taught to go to school, then go to college, then, find a spouse, raise kids, get a job, get a career. We're taught this linear path of things. But then grief comes along, like you just shared with your story, and all of a sudden you lose both your parents. Wow, that's big, heavy grief gets hit. Then divorce comes along. That's another thing that got taken out of the equation. Then it was not having the ability to have kids. And all of a sudden, this linear path that we've been taught has now been broken in many pieces. And now it's a place of, wow, I feel lost. I know you mentioned losing yourself. And I tell people a lot in coaching and I tell people in grief, losing yourself is not a bad thing, contrary to what society will show you in movies. It's not a bad thing. It's a great place to be, by the way. Um, when we lose ourselves, we lose our convictions and our beliefs. But what is left there is we start asking ourselves very powerful questions. What is the purpose of my journey? What's the purpose of grief? What does this mean to me? What do I want my life to look like? Because I'm sure not happy right now, but what do I want it to look like? We look at things like what's in our control, what's not in our control. Figuring out if that means we need to move somewhere, be in a different relationship, be in a different career path. When we lose ourselves, we give ourselves so much power back in our life to make the choices that will ultimately create a brighter future for ourselves. And so, I just want to say I appreciate you sharing your story so vulnerably.
I love what you just said, and thanks too. That was such a generous way of articulating what I shared and bringing sort of a continuity to the messiness. And I think you're right. As I was sharing, there was a linear aspect to what happened. There's a chronology there, but the feelings felt so erratic. And I think that's what I was actually experiencing as I was sharing is like, oh, and I felt that and I felt that. And then I'm like ping-ponging all over the place. And it is true, it's messy, and being comfortable with that mess is so nice for the nervous system to realize, like, you don't have to have it figured out. You don't have to proceed linearly. In fact, grief has notes of nonlinear, nonlinear callings in a way, like ritual. and creativity are allies, I think, of grief, because we don't have to be on this trajectory of like, get back on the hamster wheel as fast as you can, or you're doing really well if you're not crying, those kinds of things. And to be okay with what happens and to lose yourself. I think when you said that it's okay to lose yourself, I immediately just felt a sense of calmness. And I remember when I was sick, I still deal with these chronic diseases. They're genetic and they're lifelong. But when I was really sick and in bed for so many years, I remember thinking like, what's my worth right now? I'm not showing up as a friend. I'm not a teacher anymore. I'm really not any title. And a lot of times we're looking for our worth by the milestones, like you were saying, and these are the things we do along the way. And we get kind of nervous if we're not hitting those milestones. And I was like, I am worth, what am I worth? And I guess that during that time, I had to face the distinction between self-esteem or some sort of self-value that was compiled from accolades or my job title or any awards or popularity or anything like that that we tend to look for. Um, and I really couldn't hold on to any of those things. And you kind of realize like we have, maybe just because of our birthright, there's value and we're so unique. It kind of really blows my mind when I think that there are 8 billion people or so on this planet. And that's just in this moment of time. But yet we all have a unique fingerprint. Like that is so crazy to me that every one of us has a different fingerprint, and how metaphorical for the compilation of qualities and experiences that we bring to this world. Like every single one of us has such a vital way of moving through this world and to contribute in whatever, unique patterns and expressions that looks like. And even though I didn't have a job title at that time, and even though I was really in bed for most of those years, there is a value to every single one of us that is so stunning, And so when grief comes, this that brings all these new layers, these new ways of seeing things, these new ways of feeling into situations that I guess adds to the unique fingerprints that we're born with. And I know that my life has been most profoundly touched. And I think people that have offered empathy in ways that are so uniquely helpful because of the grief that they've experienced, and maybe the ways that they have considered their identity differently as they found themselves in these situations that have been much different than they had originally hoped for or originally like mapped out.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the biggest things that grief really humbles us by. And you said it very eloquently, but I'm really hung up on the fact that you said there's 8 billion of us on the planet. And I think that's something that we all forget, by the way, because I see it every day in my life, by the way, that people are always comparing themselves to other people all the time. Like somebody's always got more money, or somebody always has a bigger house, or somebody has a better job, or somebody has a better family, or this and that and the other. And I sit there and I go, there's 8 billion of us, all with a unique genetic genome that's made up. Where
Mm,
no two people are the same. No two people. And
no.
on top of that, all of our walks of life are different. All of us are. And so that's why, when I talk in the grief space all the time, I say, I don't want you to compare your loss to somebody. I mean, I lost a stillborn. Somebody lost their kid at 30 years old. Yes, we both lost a child, but it's very different experience. And let alone, it's not something to compare, but something to be empathetic towards. And it's something to say, this person's story has something I can learn from. And this person grieved or healed in a way that I never thought about or never thought to approach it from that perspective. That makes a lot of sense. And so when you put yourself in that place of learning and open mindset and really saying, what can I learn from somebody? Or let me listen to their story and see if how important that was, or that really impacted them when they lost their parents. And this actually made them who they are today. This is where grief carries so many powerful, powerful gifts and lessons for us in life. And I feel like when we don't hold space for that and we just tell people to move on and let go and get over it, we miss that opportunity. And I start to begin to wonder, when we miss those opportunities, how many people could we have helped if we slowed down and actually just saw that? Or if we just held space for that person, what would they have become? Because I've seen some of the most broken people, by the way, and I've interviewed a lot of them on my podcast. People that have gone through a lot of very heavy trauma, very heavy loss, very heavy grief, and they are the biggest people out there doing the
Mm,
most beautiful work. And they're changing the
mm,
world by writing books, by being coaches, by working in their communities, by starting their own business. And I just sit there and say, it was tragic what you went through. I can't even write that off, but it was tragic. But you've made this beautiful thing of the world from that experience. And so, how can we not have that place of empathy and compassion, and also at the same time, seeing that there's a big gift inside our grief that is bigger than ourselves, and that when we discover it and we go out into the world, we ultimately can make it a better place.
mhm. You know, as I think about my own life and also the people that I've been lucky enough to work with in my business, grief, I think, as you were saying, sometimes we feel like maybe our grief doesn't compare to somebody else's, or we feel like we're not allowed to grieve, or there's not enough space, just harken back to that idea of space, or I don't want to burden people with my grief, or I'm so down and how am I going to be at this gathering, or how am I going to function at work? And yet there is this um that I well let me share this. One thing that Francis Weller shared with me that I think really transformed my own experience of grief is the idea of alchemy. And if you think of alchemy when we're transmuting metals, I mean, not we, like not me, I'm not a metal transmuter, but like the idea of alchemy, when we heat metal, that's when we can transform it into something really beautiful. Like if you heat gold, you can make jewelry out of it. And when you think of the idea of in alchemical psychology, which I'm not a therapist, but just the idea of alchemical psychology is that there is a vessel, and when you put something in that vessel and you heat it, like alchemy, you can transmute it. So with grief, what goes into the vessel is our grief or the wound. And if we heat that wound, it can transmute. And the way we heat that wound is really by warming it with our affection and our kindness and our compassion. And then it transmutes, they say, into medicine that we then uniquely bring into the world, which is like so evident in your life, Chris. You have warmed these wounds that you've had, and now like the ways that you touch lives with your podcast, with the things that you're writing, the things that you're combining, the way you coach people, there is this medicine that you bring and you touch and change people's lives. And I think one of the missing pieces is, how do we vessel those wounds? How do we vessel our grief to make it safe enough, to give space enough for people to warm their grief with kindness and compassion? Because a lot of times we're trying to get over it, or we we feel like we have to get over it, which isn't really possible, you know. But to bring kindness and warmth instead of like trying to stuff it down, or not be not give it enough space. I keep going back to that space because grief needs space to tell our stories about the grief, to share, to be witness for what we went through, to touch that grief with kindness instead of thinking of it as something we have to get through. And in that process, there is such a beauty, it's such a sharing. um, and even when two people or more than two people share their griefs, there's a feeling of like, oh my gosh, me too. maybe my grief isn't exactly the same, but I felt that, or I felt that loneliness. I was in that dark space. I thought I wasn't going to make it another day. Like, there's so many different places that we can connect rather than rather than to find ourselves alone in that grief space. And whether we're going through the grief or whether we're bringing medicine to others after or, along our journey, I think what you were saying about stopping and connecting is so important. And like, I really see that in your life. You really see that.
Yeah, it's something that I've learned, in my grief journey because I have been around people that have not held space for me, and I've learned that, the funny part about grief is that there's a lot of different stages to it, and I'm not a big fan of the 5 stages of grief and death that are out there because I don't, it's not linear, and most people don't follow those things linearly. Um,
Right.
but I always try to tell people when you go through a very heavy loss there's a lot of anger there, lots of it. And that's one of the
Yeah.
phases that I think is very misunderstood. I've heard people still to this day talk about anger in a completely wrong context. It's just a very outdated mindset of things. And what I don't think people understand, by the way, is that when you go through grief and you are experiencing anger, for example, um, that anger really is love. It's not anger. That's just what you see at the face value of things. But underneath that, is really your love for those you lost. And that's where, I think it makes people uncomfortable because they're scared to go down to that place of listening to their emotions and feeling them. And
Mm-hmm.
I've been very big on my journey through coaching I've had since 2018 that our emotions are messengers. All of those things are
Yes.
messengers. They're not
Yes.
I love people to say, well, I can't feel like this and be stuck in my grief. Maybe you need to be stuck in your grief. I'll challenge that and say, maybe you need to be stuck there. And
Mm-hmm.
somebody will say, well, that's not healthy. And I said, well, it's also not healthy to bury your emotions or avoid them. I said, they will come back, by the way, in a very inopportune moment of your life and present themselves. And now you're going to have a big mound of something to fix over something small. And so, I always say
Mm-hmm.
that, when you go through grief, there's so many things to learn and so many things to be aware of. And, using anger and emotions, 'cause those are the two examples I can come up with, is anger is a part of you that loves you the most. It's not some big nasty thing that wants to be violent and all those crazy things you hear. Anger is saying, hey, I'm hurt. I'm really, really hurt. I lost my parents. I lost my child. I lost my home. I lost my job. I ended up divorced, whatever it may be. Anger is trying to tell you that there's a big part of you that's hurt and it's trying to protect you. Your emotions, by the way, are also trying to communicate to you and say things like, hey, I know this is a really painful experience you're going through. I want you to acknowledge where you are right now. But I also want you to know that you're hurt and here's why. And here's what's driving you to feel the way you do. And I think that's where, when we see people, I see it in the grief space all the time when people get addicted to drugs or they do something, outlandish, whatever it is. They're not listening to their emotions. Those aren't the problems.
Mm-hmm.
Addictions and grief are not the problem. It's the fact that we're not listening to emotions that are there trying to communicate to us. And that's where we have to help educate people on how to feel these things through grief and holding space that we keep coming back to today. Holding space for somebody. And I know that's uncomfortable. I've been there. I've talked to people in grief and very, very facets of life. Most things I have not experienced in myself. And I've said, wow, I don't even know how you're standing right now. But
Mm-hmm.
again, I look at those people and say, you have strength in a moment I might not have. And had I not listened to your experience, I might not be listening to my own emotions. I might not even be listening to what's being presented to me on this journey. And
Mm-hmm.
so I just
Yeah.
think there's so much power to holding space for grief and allowing ourselves to listen to other people's experiences and their stories because we ultimately, that's the collective learning that we're all here for on this planet for a reason.
Yeah, I'm really moved by what you were saying regarding emotions and anger. I feel like that's a lot of my own story. And if we were to language this in the idea of soul work, I think it's really so similar, if not the same, with your coaching, Chris. Let me share this and see. I'd love to get your thoughts on this. With anger or any emotion being a messenger, then there is an allyship with these emotions that we can really take so much heart from, so much wisdom, right? There's such an intelligence in these emotions, but if we were to look at soul work sort of gives a larger context as to how I experience emotion. I'll use myself as an example, but I think everybody who's listening could maybe think about it from their own perspective. For me, if I was to consider anger and my experience of it, and I think what you said, we have an outdated way of really working with anger or understanding it. And I definitely agree with that. Depending on what our experience was growing up, we probably have a different relationship with anger. And I know that when I was younger, I was around some people who yelled a lot. And to my little self, that was so scary. That was so scary that my little girl decided, I am never going to get angry. That is a very bad feeling, and I don't want any of that in my life. And that younger adaptation is something that I really had to work through and find a different relationship with anger, because then, you become more codependent, you become more agreeable, you maybe don't ever understand what the value of anger is. And so there is that younger adaptation. And then maybe for some, as you move into teen years, maybe there's a different way of dealing with anger. And again, people might have, as a young child, maybe they have a different relationship with anger than mine. But in teen years, we can further that shutting down of anger, or we can maybe become passive aggressive, or become more angry, or we can be avoidant. Like, there's so many different ways to deal with that emotion rather than experiencing it as something that is helpful and that is signaling a boundary issue, or that is signaling for grief that we've lost something that we really love, or that something unjust happened, or something was very disappointing. And anger would be such a natural, beautiful way of responding to something like that. And so to try to learn and to turn towards that part of ourself that maybe experience anger differently is some of the work that I love to do with people. Is how is our our younger understanding of anger, how is that impacting us now? And how can we sort of separate from that and learn a different way of relating with anger and grief? Because for some, emotions maybe weren't safe. Maybe they were told they were too sensitive, or maybe their parents were really emotional and that scared them, or, whatever. There could be different reasons that we either fear these emotions or that we want to shut them down. But to be able to parse that out and understand where we are coming from, so that we can develop a more healthy relationship with these emotions and be able to take advantage of the messages that they're bringing, as well as engage that feeling, and to let it move through, and to understand it. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
So I had a lot of thoughts while you were talking about emotions, and I love the thought provoking that you have. It's a beautiful gift. The thing that I think scares people about emotions is that we're taught how to not feel them. We're taught how to bury them and hide them and avoid them.
Yes.
And that's where, if we go through our life like that, by the way, we will end up in many situations where we don't know how to respond appropriately. And that's why I love to pick anger, because it's the easiest one people can relate to. When you see somebody get very angry, and even people who get violent, by the way, they're just not taught how to feel emotions. It really is that simple. I hate to say that. It's really that simple. They were not taught how to feel emotions. They were not taught how to express themselves. They weren't even given space to even understand why they feel the way they do. And so, what really happens is that we run into an intensity situation with emotions. And that's where grief is a very hard thing for a lot of people to grasp, because you are going to feel very intense emotions, not because you chose it or wanted it, but it presented itself to you. And that's
Mm,
where, when we don't learn how to handle those things growing up as kids or even teenagers, we, for lack of a better term, mishandle those things as adults. And guess what? Again, I'm not blaming anybody for that because I didn't even know that myself, and most people don't. But when you have intensity of emotion, that's what I like to focus on with people. Um, there's a show that I watched called Letterkenny out of Canada, and there's a scene in the show
mm,
with a guy who, very big, heavy set guy, but he takes a women's studies class and he's very big into that whole thing. And there's a scene that happens that makes him really frustrated. And he gets up on a rant, angry, screaming. And his friend looks at him because he's like tired of him screaming. And he goes, "What's your problem?" And the guy goes, "I'm just upset." And he says it very calm and very quiet. And I use this example to say that his initial reaction was intense emotion, go really high in the intensity and really just get that all out, all that anger. And
mhm,
when his friend came along and said, "Why are you so upset?" and said in this very like loud tone, he goes, "I was upset." And he says it very quiet. The acknowledging part of that emotion he was feeling is that quiet part. I was upset. All the
mhm,
loud stuff, by the way, that's just the intensity of the emotion. Now,
mhm,
people tend to fixate on intensity. They don't actually fixate on the emotion. And that's where we get messed up in a lot of ways, in grief or even in anger, because again, we stop holding space because we now associate intensity with this is bad, this is wrong, something awful is going to happen here, this shouldn't be happening, you're out of control, you shouldn't be feeling this way. See how we start trying to fix people and label things, and all of a sudden it spirals out of control and people don't even know why. And it's because they do that. But if we actually take time to hold space for somebody and say, "Well, how are you actually feeling right now?" Or say, "Hey, it seems like you're very upset about this." And don't say you're upset because it implies blame, but just say, "Hey, it seems like you're upset or something bothered you. Would you like to talk about that?" You will find somebody come off intensity real quick and go right down to, "This is how I feel." And that's where
mhm,
we can really find out what is that emotion going on. And that gets us to our next step of things where I like to go, which is, what's causing you to feel that way? Or how did this situation unfold that presented this to you? And
mhm,
a lot of people will actually open up sometimes and say things like, "I'm having a really hard time because my grandfather just, is his anniversary of death on Monday. And this
mhm,
must be my grief coming out. And I'm still really upset about that, or I still have feelings about that moment." And when we get people in that place, there's not intensity, but there's emotion there that we're actually talking to. And that's
mhm,
where we can feel and understand what's really going on and hold space for that. And then, by the way, when we do those two things, somebody goes, "Oh, okay, this is how I feel." And then they say, "Okay,
mhm,
I can make a different choice right now." Or, "You know what? I needed to acknowledge that. I needed to give myself space for that. I'm going to give myself this moment right now to just acknowledge how I feel." And
mhm,
that's where we can have a cataclysmic shift in how we treat grief or how we treat anger or how we treat other people. That's a very simple but very powerful, powerful tool that can help us register our emotions a little better.
that's a beautiful portrayal, and it makes so much sense. It reminds me of this time when I was going through some of my deeper grief. So my mom, she died in February, and then we barely had a chance to get through that. And then my dad died in April, and then my student died in May, and it was just so much of like deep love lost. And I was trying to hold it together because, like I said, I was, trying to stuff all these emotions down and not feel them, like you were saying earlier, which doesn't work. It just doesn't work because it's so you're it is love. There is so much love in that space. And what I was going to say is it reminded me of this body work person that I went to maybe a year or two after. I'm not really sure when it was, but I had been trying to hold all of that emotion inside for so long. And I went to this really beautiful body work person, and she did some massage, but she was also really skilled in a lot of different modalities of therapy. And she integrated body, mind, and spirit. And you store these emotions like in your body, right? And she gave me the permission to express what I was feeling, and she could feel all of these holdings. And so she was like, you can voice it. And I couldn't even believe what came out of my body, having that permission and that safety. And I like I opened my mouth, and this bellowing, like bellowing sound started coming from all cells of my body. I felt like it was almost like a howl. And it I felt like it went to Mars. Like I had never heard so much sound coming out of my body, and it wasn't controlled, and it wasn't like nice and cute, but it felt for the first time like this release that I had needed, that I was so afraid of. And I guess that in some sense is the intensity that you're talking about. But, to be able to have permission to let out these emotions, that brought me to a place of calm, and also in knowing that like I need to be able to engage this part of me that needs to express itself, whether it's just in raw emotion, whether it's in anger. Sometimes I will dance my emotion, just turn on some either screaming music or maybe a drum circle, and just let the emotion move out of my body, to just say, yeah, I'm feeling this, and I can't stick it all down there. It feels so good to be able to release it. And in that, sometimes it then turns to tears. Sometimes it then turns to poetry, like maybe a poetry will fall out into my journal somehow. But to be able to give yourself permission to feel that intensity and then engage where it came from. And I think that allows the movement. We're not then stuck and stuffing and stuck there. But yeah, thank you for sharing that idea that comes from, was it a movie that it came from, did you say, or
Oh, that was just from a TV show I watched.
TV show?
But
Yeah.
it was
Like,
such a beautiful example of what can happen if you just listen to your emotion instead of the intensity of it. And your example that you gave, by the way, of screaming like that, I think that's a beautiful thing. It makes most people nervous. I say go for it.
me
Because
too. Yeah.
I mean, people don't understand, but when you leave your emotions inside you and you try to suppress them and push them down, it's like watching a Chinese ping pong tournament. You'll see the ball that moves across the table and you barely can see it. That's what that emotion's doing inside you. And that's why you end up with random pain in your body, or your stomach feels off, or you become sick or have a disease. Something like that can happen because of emotions. It's not necessarily something wrong with your body, but it's where the emotion gets stored. And so, when
Yes.
and I thought about how you brought up when you were talking about Francis Weller, 10 years later, you had that moment
Mhm.
with him. He
Yeah.
probably just made you feel safe enough and comfortable enough and held space for you to actually just allow that to be, allow that to exist. And that's a
Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful gift that he gave you.
Yeah, absolutely. He wrote this book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which just the title is amazing. And that book is does like embody so much of what you're saying. Like, how do we provide safe places for grief? The idea that grief requires a vessel. Even for deep psychic work, we need a holding, a place where we know that we're safe enough to not go under. Sometimes people are scared to even touch their grief because, like, how will you not go under? But to have ways of holding that grief, whether that is by the company of someone who is letting you, like, sort of be in this safe space with them. And that is definitely what happened in that moment. Or if it's a grief group or circle where all of you come into this space, intent on holding for each other, or even like when you're writing if you set a timer, that's another thing that Frances or Natalie Goldberg too, she wrote a book called Writing Down the Bones, and she suggests, I think, writing for 10 minutes. There's something that informs your psyche that you're being held for with time. I'm going to journal about this for 10 minutes and I'm going to come back out of it. There's something about that safety of vesseling that allows us to be a little freer and engaging our grief because we are not alone, or we know that we're being held. And it also harkens back to the idea of alchemy, where it requires a vessel to heat it before it transmutes. And so, yeah, thank you for mentioning Francis. I would recommend his work to anybody who would love to know a little bit more about alchemy and grief. He also has another book coming out. It's called In the Absence of the Ordinary, and I think it comes out this month or next month. Um, but yeah, he's a very, very special person, an elder in the grief field that has changed my life. Like maybe the person who's changed my life the most, probably.
That's
Yeah,
really beautiful. Yeah. I
yeah.
yeah, have you read a book called Many Lives, Many Masters by chance?
No, should I should, huh? I
Okay.
think
Yeah, it's
about.
I just finished reading this book over the last week, and I'm deeply into spiritual work and things like that. But it really helped me have a little bit better understanding of grief and a bigger context of things. But it's a
Mm.
guy that wrote the book. He's a psychologist, and he worked with doing hypnosis sessions with his patients. And there was a woman that he was doing psychology sessions with hypnosis, and she started recalling past lives that she lived, and it was in very, very vivid detail, like you were almost living it while she was talking. And
Wow.
what came through, this went on for I think like 2 years or something, and he documented it with audio tapes, and he wrote the book based off the audio tapes. But what was
Mm.
interesting about this book is she apparently lived 80 some different lifetimes on Earth. And sometimes she was a man, sometimes she was a woman, sometimes she was in, like in Egypt, for example, she helped them preparing bodies that had passed. Other times she was a sailor on a ship, and then she was a pilot in a plane, and all these different lifetimes that happened. But what was interesting about every one of her stories when she would end her hypnosis sessions is that there were these spiritual masters, if you will, not God, but somebody close to God, if you will. And they started actually connecting with the psychologist through her. And what the masters teach in this book is that our purpose of living through our lives actually has nothing to do with our material side of things or even, um, what we really necessarily do in life, but it's what we learn from this a life that we work through. And so
Mm.
it's all about the fact that we have these experiences in our life, not that they're happening to us, but they're happening for us because we need to learn lessons or we need to have experiences to understand something. And it really made me reflect on grief as I read through this book because I started realizing that, like you, I've had a lot of compound heavy loss all in a short window of time, and it's very easy to say, why is this happening to me? Or why did I deserve this? Or why did this have to happen to me? And there's everybody asks that question, by the way, so you're not wrong for doing it. But what I want to share though is that this book really opened my eyes up to these things actually happened for you. They didn't happen to you. They all were happening to teach you things. They were there to show you a deeper level of who you are as a person and what you're capable of and what you're meant to learn and grow from and contribute in this lifetime. And I thought about grief as I was reading this book, and I started sitting there saying, yes, I've been through some very painful things, and I've listened to other people go through very painful things. But that grief put us on a trajectory of creation in our life that you never would have gotten if you'd never gone through that. I mean, I'm sure if you'd never gone through losing your parents, losing that student, going through a divorce, those are all very heavy losses, all back to back. Would you necessarily be in the grief space coaching people? Maybe not. I
No
mean,
way. No, not a chance. Yeah, no, and as I've been listening to your podcast too, I mean, some of the people that your guests have gone, some of your guests have gone through like unimaginable losses, and that's how I feel too about what you've gone through, Chris. And you just wonder, how in the world would you move through this? It seems impossible. And the and I don't want to say that I wish that on anybody. I don't want to say that at all, but it has been so moving to see the medicine that each of your guests and you, like, I keep coming back to you, what powerful lives are unfolding, beautiful, sensitive, loving contributions, you know?
Yeah, I mean it's a gift that came out of my loss. It came out of it. And I didn't ask for it, by the way, and it took me over, close to 3 years to find it. And that's where I've always said this to share too, and I talk to people like you on my podcast. My podcast is bigger than me. It's not the Chris Mamone show. It's bigger than
Mm,
me. It's about other people coming on and sharing their grief stories, their healing journeys, what they learned, what they do differently, how they navigated things. I really, I found, and that's why I shared that book that I just read, Many Lives, Many Masters, that there's so much for us to learn on our time here on earth. There's so much to learn. And there's not enough money, material things that are going to help you find that, but it's going to be found in the connections, the relationships, and through that healing journey you take through grief. And I don't ever want people to experience a loss like I've gone through or like you've gone through. I don't want that for people. But what I will say is that eventually something like that is going to happen. And it's going to be very tragic. It's going to be very hard. It's not going to, you're going to feel insufferable at that point. You're going to just sit there and
mhm,
say, in this very, I call it the bottom of the well, like one of my podcast guests talked about on her episode. You're going to find yourself on the bottom of the well staring up at a pin dot of sunlight. And it's going to be in that place, by the way, that you are going to find yourself. You are going to figure out what this meaning was, this purpose, why this happened for you. You're going to find that. And then it's just really this collective cycle, I like to call it, of now that you've gone through that, you can help somebody else that's going to go through it. And my biggest thing I say as a coach is that I've gone through a lot of things in my life that if I come across somebody else who might be going through that, if I share something with them, just one thing, and this goes for everybody, by the way, who listens to this podcast, you, me, everybody. If you
mhm,
come across somebody who's going through something similar to you, but you happen to sit there and say, I went through that, and here's how I navigated it, here's what I learned, you might save that person years off their life. You might give that person such a beautiful gift to not take 5 or 10 years to figure out. They might figure it out in one or two. And now your experience that you went through wasn't all for nothing. It wasn't some horrible, tragic thing that happened. It was actually a very big gift that I like to say is a gift in shitty wrapping paper. It's one that gave you a very
mm,
powerful thing to help other people. And then collectively, if that person figures it out sooner, they're going to find somebody else that is in that situation. They're going to help them figure it out sooner. And so it's a big collective cycle of paying it forward and doing the right thing in humanity. And that's where, I always like to say again, like it's never really about you. It's not all about you. It's really about what you're giving forward to the collective. And that's how we heal the earth. That's how we heal the planet. That's how we heal our friends, our family, our coworkers, random strangers we meet. This is how we
mhm.
heal ourselves. And when you think about that, it doesn't take much. It doesn't take a lot of effort. But it's something that gives such a huge, huge gift that just continues to fall like dominoes through different generations. And that's
Mhm.
how we just make the world a better place.
Yeah,
So.
and more than ever right now, we can't look 2 inches away without seeing tragedy and on the earth with different people groups. Like, it is a really grief-filled time. And I think what you're saying is we bring these medicines, as we bring these contributions, one life at a time, one moment at a time. Hopefully, the spaciousness for grief will increase. The scaffolding for grief will be more immense, so that we're not going through these alone. We're not, there are definitely cultures and different people groups that maybe handle grief differently, but a lot of us on the Western side of things anyway, we we don't have, it's more individualized, it's more alone, and it's less space as we keep going, as we keep saying. But the what you're saying, um, and the way you're moving through, I do think that is what we need so much right now. So
It
much.
really, it really is. I mean, the biggest thing I see, and we both live in the U.S., but I'll say we're living in a very heated time in this country. A very
Yeah.
just a time where divisive is the word I'm looking for. That's the word I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking for. We're living in a very divisive time of politics, culture, um, social aspects of our life. And I see so much focus on labels and groups and, think my way or you're a terrible person. And that is really tearing us all apart. I like it drives me nuts watching this happen over the last 5 years. Like it's driving us all apart. And that's where, I try to sit there and say, grief, doesn't discriminate. Funny story. It doesn't care what gender you are. It doesn't care what race you are. It doesn't care where you came from, how many family members you have, what job title you have, what monetary status you have. It doesn't care. It will take you at whatever cost. So I always look at it from that point and I say, I'm less concerned about labels. I'm less concerned about your background. I'm less concerned about all these things. What I see collectively at a whole is I see a person who's gone through an experience that's changing them or has changed them. And I start to
Mm-hmm.
sit there and say, what if we get out of division land and we come right down to this place of here's a person and this person's experiencing something. And maybe, by the way, I have something to learn from this person, or maybe this person has something to teach me, or maybe the roles reversed and I have something to teach them or something to help them learn. And what if we got there? Because that's in the place where grief, by the way, like I said, it doesn't discriminate. So at that point, we're all equals. We all have something to benefit from each other. And when we get to that place, by the way, grief has a very deep, a very profound, and a very powerful meaning in itself. And that's where I think we can shed a lot of ideologies we've had over the years and really celebrate and honor our gifts. If it wasn't for my son Caden, I wouldn't have a podcast. I wouldn't be coaching across the world. I wouldn't be writing a book. I wouldn't be helping people the way that I am. And so, for what not to say that, yes, that was a horrible, tragic loss of a child, but it was a child that gave me a beautiful gift that I can be nothing but grateful for. And I can do that by creating a legacy and honoring a life. And that's the same thing, same opportunity you have. It's the same opportunity every guest on my show has, and every single person I run across that's going through grief. And you all have that same opportunity. Nobody has it better than you. Really, nobody does. And
Mm-hmm.
so I just see so much potential in us unlocking our gifts. And those gifts, by the way, will set us all free. But they will also just make so much power in this world that will bring us together. And that's where I just feel like we have so much opportunity in this space.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are so human at the root of it, humans that love and feel and lose and don't want to be alone and have hopes and dreams and scars and fears. And I think really dialing into the human spirit. I know there are larger problems and issues and things in this world, but I love what you say about like you're human and I'm human and we have the sameness here. And to be able to share our griefs and our beautiful contributions with each other is so meaningful.
Well, if I could get the rest of the world on board with that strategy, this would be a much nicer place. I'll tell you
Well, I think you are. I
that.
definitely think you are.
Yeah, we just, I went to a Tony Robbins event in 2020 and I talked to people that didn't even speak English, by the way, people that are in foreign countries, and we all had the same challenges, by the way. This was the most funny part of
Mm,
things. I talked to people in four different cultures, four different languages, across the world in many places, and we all had the same challenges, the same problems, the same everything. And I sat there and said, I used to think this was an isolated thing. And now that I see that it's all over the world, I said, how
Wow.
cool is that we're in the same place right now and we can barely understand each other because we had to have translator and typing. But I said,
Google Translate. Yeah.
yeah, but I was like, even through that, when you think about how powerful that is, that we're connecting on that level despite the inability to communicate clearly between each other. But you could see it in your face, you could see it in the
Mm.
emotion, you could see it in the people. And that's what I just think is so amazing a gift of humanity is exactly that. Um, so
Wow. Yeah.
so just, that's why I think grief is something that brings us together. I think it's something that needs to be honored. It needs to be given space. It needs to be heard and seen and understood. And it's just something that can really take our life in a whole different direction. And that whole different direction, by the way, it's where we're supposed to be. It's where we're supposed to go. It's our alignment. And I always tell people from a spiritual aspect, when you're in your alignment where you need to be, everything will fall into place for you. You don't have to push it. You don't have to force it. It
Mhm.
will come to you and gravitate to you. And that's why I said you can always look at grief in that capacity and you're in that mind state and say, yes, this was hard. Yes, this was tragic, but this is a beautiful gift that came out of it. And had it not been for this experience, I would not be who I am today.
Mm. When you said grief, the idea of grief, like bringing us together, it's true, isn't it? Like in a way, grief wrecked me. It wrecked me, and just to bring it full circle from earlier, when you were saying you kind of lose your way or you lose yourself, but maybe we just, in some ways, lose this self that we're trying to build to be acceptable enough to we're comparing and we want to be acceptable enough. But grief, when it wrecked me, it brought me down just to me, like who I am as a unique beating heart. And I love that at this Tony Robbins event there were these samenesses, these human spirits that have the same brilliancy and the same grieving hearts. And that, I think, really does bring us into who we are in the essence of who I am. And the essence of who I am can meet the essence of you, because I'm not trying to compare myself or build a certain something. And maybe I'm more settled in my spirit and can see more clearly in some ways. But I think grief does bring some of the pretenses down, some of the things that are unnecessary around down. And that's kind of cool.
It really is. I always share with people that grief is a process of taking away everything that doesn't belong in your life, and that's painful. But
Yeah.
it makes room for who you're becoming, and that's why people get so uncomfortable with grief is that you're meeting the new version of you, and it's always one of these, I don't know what this is, I don't know what this looks like, I'm not sure how to respond to it or talk to it or behave around it. And you got to learn that. And that's why I always say grief is not a 1 day journey or a 7 day seminar. It's not. Um, some people,
So true.
some people, can do it in a year. Some people take 10. It's not for me to tell you how long it's going to take because there is no time limit on it. But I know that what I leave people with is that grief is going to be its own time frame for you. And when it is ready to show you that next phase to move forward with, it's going to show it to you in a very powerful way. And only you know how that is. I can't sit here and tell you, but you will know. And when you do know, you're going to feel so comfortable in that new skin and you're going to say, I made it to the other side, and you're going to have nothing but gratitude there. That's what's going to exist. And so,
Mhm.
uh, I'm very honored, like you, Lori, to walk alongside people in this grief journey. And I may not have all the answers, I may not know everything, and I sure as heck won't, but we can walk that together. And that's where we can both learn.
Yes. Francis Weller, he talks about having an apprenticeship with sorrow because sorrow does weave through our lives and to not be afraid of it. And what I love what you're saying is like we we aren't the same. We are not the same after going through these different experiences. And there also is such a beauty in walking that together and not doing that alone or hiding. I mean, we of course need our alone time, but even this conversation today, there's a togetherness here that has imprinted on me that I leave different. I think after talking to you, I feel different. You've given me so many beautiful things to check out, like this TV series and a book and all of these practical ideas too. But just having been with you and having shared a little bit of our story together, that is so deepening and that feels so nice to just, yeah, be together through grief.
Well, Lori, I'm going to wrap with you here today. I think this is a good place for us to wrap up the podcast. And I would love to invite you back, by the way, for a part two, because I think we can build from here.
I would love
But
that. Yes.
but it's absolutely been a beautiful conversation, and I'm really grateful you and I got to connect a month ago. This is I see us staying connected as we go through the podcast world and having some opportunities to collaborate and work together in the future.
I'd love that, Chris. Yes, thank you. I think the world of you.
Well, thank you.
Yes.
That feeling's mutual. Well, as we wrap up the podcast, I usually ask my guests two questions at the end. One of them is, if you were to run into somebody who's going through grief or maybe feel stuck in grief, what's one thing you would share with them to help them navigate that journey just a little bit easier?
Hmm. I think I will touch back into the idea of alchemy. We think that our grief is something that we have to get rid of or handle, but I think if we can think of it as something that alchemizes, that grief is in the vessel and it transmutes into medicine, and to trust that. But in that transmutation, it's so important to warm it with our kindness and our affection and our devotion. And I think giving ourselves permission and space and the right people with which we can bring a tenderness, a more tender, compassionate touch to the grief. Um, because I guess it's because it's my story where I thought I had to get rid of it or swallow it, but just to find places where there's space to bring stories and art and love and maybe a bellowing scream, whatever that is, to be in relationship with your grief and to find ways to do that, and especially knowing that that's good and not wrong.
I think that's a beautiful way to tie up the podcast, Lori. I appreciate that.
Mm.
And then I wanted to ask you too, if people want to connect with you after listening to this episode, where can they find you?
Oh, thank you. I think the best place is my website that has all of the different things. It's called asanctuaryforthesoul.com, asanctuaryforthesoul, SOUL.com. And that has my grief work, my life coaching, my podcast. That has everything there. So that'd probably be the best way. Yeah,
I love
thanks.
that. Yeah, well, for listeners, if you guys are listening to the episode today, look in the show notes when you get done listening to the podcast. You'll find Laura's website down there, which will have a link to her podcast as well as her coaching. I definitely recommend you guys connect with her and check her out. She's a phenomenal person, as you guys have heard through this podcast today. And Lori, again, I just want to say thank you so much for being on, and we will definitely connect for a second episode here.
Oh my gosh, Chris, this was such an incredible experience. And most of all, I just appreciate being in connection with you. I look forward to collaborating. I'm so grateful for you, and I'm definitely going to be referring people to your work. So thank you for being you. This was such a gift. I really appreciate it.
Well, you're very welcome, and the feeling is mutual for me. So I'm looking forward to staying in touch.
Me
Well, I want
too.
well, I want to thank all of our listeners for joining Laura and I today on this episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with somebody you know who could benefit from Lori's story. For more episodes that are designed to empower you and support you during your grief journey, visit empowergriefjourney.com and subscribe to this podcast. You can find us on Apple and Spotify. The Empower Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. I want you to know that you're never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.